Some dare call it conspiracy.
Welcome to Chemtrails on Trial, an 8-part series produced by Some Dare Call It Conspiracy. If you would like access to the entire series right now, join us on patreon.com/somedarecallitconspiracy. The following is the debunk section. This is episode 6.
Right, so we've been looking at chemtrails. So the first sort of major time that chemtrails were mentioned was by William Thomas on the Art Bell show all the way back there. And if you remember, Art doesn't really even know what to do with it. At the beginning, he's talking about UFOs and are they monitoring it? And then he proposes perhaps it's an inoculation program. But he's really sort of being introduced to it in the same way that we were being introduced to it by William Thomas. And also Linda Moulton Howe. And she talks about the large X's and stuff in Phoenix, Arizona and Sedona, Arizona. And these do happen. Again, we've said right from the start, basically, contrails do form and they do persist. Now, this is where we're going to get into a sort of immediate break in the audience. Because the long and short of it is that the evidence that people suggest is that the reason these aren't real contrails is because contrails should not persist. They should dissipate. They shouldn't stay in the sky for that length of time because they should evaporate. And the response to that is, that's just simply not true. It just isn't true, I'm afraid. It depends entirely on a number of things. The temperature, the moisture in the atmosphere, the pressure in the atmosphere, and the conditions. Just to give an explanation, like aircraft fuel is composed primarily of hydrocarbons, which generate carbon dioxide and water vapor as their main combustion byproducts. So contrails are formed when hot exhaust gases mix with rarefied cool air or high altitude low pressure, and the water condenses around the soot from the exhausts and it freezes, forming a haze of microscopic ice crystals. So essentially it forms a man-made cloud. This is essentially what's called a cirrus cloud. That's what happens, basically. If the temperature and the atmospheric pressure is right, there's no reason for it to evaporate. It will stay in that cold temperature. It will stay with the relevant amount of moisture, and it will form a cloud in the same way that natural clouds form. Now, to be fair, similar to car exhausts, like plane exhausts aren't actually harmless. Plane exhausts apparently contribute to over 10,000 deaths per year. This is because they actually do reduce air quality, like the aviation emissions. The particulates that come out of it do include nasty stuff. So there's sulfur dioxide, there's nitrogen dioxide, and actually emissions from planes kill more people per year than plane crashes.
Whoa.
Yeah, absolutely. A huge amount of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, including lung cancers, are actually down to emissions from planes reaching the ground. So, to be fair, it's not an implausible theory, but the concept that these things would disappear straight away isn't true. It depends on the conditions. Here's another thing, like India, for example, has about 1,700 deaths per year that are attributed to plane emissions. But these aren't due to emissions in India. These are actually due to emissions that have been transported across by the wind from Europe and from the USA. So,
really?
So this is the thing about there is a genuine problem with harmful particulates like that are out of plane exhausts spreading across the globe and actually causing people harm and causing people damage and ultimately killing people. And it's not just, the same thing with car emissions, same thing with emissions from ships. Apparently the emissions from ships cause approximately 60,000 deaths per year. But what happens is that cirrus clouds and contrails linger when there's more moisture in the atmosphere. Like cirrus clouds often precede a hazy, overcast day. So they assume that that's causing the cloud cover. And yes, it does. But if the conditions are there for these clouds to not freeze. It means that there's enough moisture in the atmosphere, and it means that the temperature is sufficiently cool, which means that eventually that cloud cover will happen anyway. Do planes contribute to that cloud cover? Absolutely. This is actually a thing. And the irony is, it actually contributes to global warming. Like, apparently, exhausts, and this is of all exhausts, cause 57% of air industry's climate impact. And due to the high atmospheric position that plane clouds are in, they trap the air underneath it and they heat the planet. So this is bizarre. Like, ships emissions, which is where they got the idea for the reflective thing, they're low. So they create something called an albedo, which reflects the sun back up. What happens with the contrails, particularly when they freeze and are persistent, they're a lot higher up. And so they actually trap the heat beneath it. And so they contribute to global warming, which is massively, massively ironic. But when Linda Moulton Howe is basically saying we saw these X's and then we saw it crisscross and then we saw it dissipate across, that does happen. It's condensation turning into ice crystals, and the atmospheric conditions that create the ice crystals allow them to linger. It's a well-observed phenomenon. We do understand it. It's not actually that strange, to be quite honest. So immediately, this is where we're going to get the immediate break, because basically, like, that's your answer, that this is exactly what the air industry says it is. And a lot of the time, they're going to go on about basically like, well, they only form at a certain temperature. You can create it. There are videos, for example, of planes trying to take off in Russia, and they immediately form contrails on the ground because they're in minus 45 degrees and they're in a very moist atmosphere. So we can recreate the creation of these types of man-made cirrus clouds. So the immediate concept that they should disappear just simply isn't the smoking gun that people believe it to be, I'm afraid. Now, a lot of people are going to go, yes, it is. It's like, well, there's nothing I can do for you there.
One thing I would want to detail here is that something I read, like reading up into doing this episode, is that a study in 2014 found that biofuels could reduce contrail generation because they have fewer subparticles. So it's kind of the sort of less emissions the plane is putting out, the less chemtrails it puts out.
Yeah.
And the reason why that would be is because it's a process called heterogeneous nucleation, where if you imagine like in a liquid, you've got atoms sort of bouncing around. Instantaneously, they may sort of cluster together in the same way that a solid would, but it will be unstable above the sort of temperature where it solidifies. So when you put that below it, you'll have like homogeneous nucleation, which means that you'll form essentially a circle. Those atoms will cluster up into a sphere, and it will have an energy penalty because you're creating an interface, but you're also lowering the energy at the same time. So you have those two effects competing. When you have a heterogeneous nucleation, so if it gets big enough, it will be able to become stable, and that's how solidification sort of happens and it grows. But if it's not, it will break apart. So with heterogeneous nucleation, say part of a surface, for instance, like the surface of a subparticle, will also absorb, sort of reduce the energy needed to form it. So that's why you would get more contrails if you have more subparticles and all those sort of particulates coming out of the engine. So that's, well, it's not necessarily metallurgy, but it is solidification.
Nerd.
Okay, yeah, fine.
But again, this is the point. Like, this is a mechanism that is actually sort of, you know, it is well known. Like, now potentially there's more evidence because we haven't looked at the contents. But immediately off the bat, this idea that there's no way that they should persist, that's just nonsense. And this idea that there's no way that they should form in grid patterns, assuming that they persist, because, you know, the atmospheric pressure will be the same. The grid patterns is formed because essentially planes all follow similar flight paths. Not necessarily always exactly the same, because basically they can be blown miles off course by the wind. But essentially, if I'm going from Nottingham to New York, it's always going to be the same direction, roughly, unless I'm going to go the opposite way around the globe, because New York is always that way, basically. So despite getting blown about, you're still following these flight paths, so to speak. And what happens is, because they persist for hours, they get blown. So the contrails can actually get blown miles and miles and miles. And so we've already discussed how particulate ends up in India from the USA and Europe that actually kills people there. But these ice particles, these ice clouds essentially, they get blown along. So if you've got 6 planes going to New York and you've got 6 planes going to California or whatever, there's a point where they're going to cross, or these flight paths are going to cross. And what happens is over time, the wind blows these and it gives the impression of an X or a grid pattern or some sort of pattern. And then as it breaks down, it does form cloud, basically.
Yeah.
It forms cloud cover.
Yeah. This was absolutely revelatory to me.
Mm.
Like, it made so much sense finally.
Yeah, there's an explanation for it. Now, there are certain things like William Thomas is saying that I didn't see this when I was a kid, and we'll come on to this, but basically he's absolutely right because there's far more planes in the sky nowadays than there were. So the opportunity to create these lingering contrails is far greater, basically. But anyway, so how he was peaked onto this was he got the video from the gentleman William Wallace. Now, William Wallace, I don't know if it is a sort of Braveheart thing, but he certainly did seem to give him some freedom. But anyway.
Oh, come on.
Hey, that's good, that. Anyway, so they're talking about these KC-10s and KC-135s, and basically what they're saying is that they don't work like that. There's no way that it should actually work like that. They don't go this high. And he even cites a military officer. He's saying that basically this high-ranking military officer is telling us that our KC-10s just do not go that high. The Major General is saying, our tankers do not emit contrails ever because they don't fly high enough. So I went and checked this. I went to Boeing and looked at KC-10s, and they're saying basically they refuel at 8,000 feet odd, and they don't go high enough to create contrails. And that's a flat-out lie on 2 counts. One, the KC-10 has got a flight ceiling, as far as I'm aware, of 41,000 feet. So it can go sufficiently high enough to reach those cold temperatures. And 2, you don't need to be that high to create contrails. You can create it on the ground if the conditions are right. There is a famous footage of a plane creating contrails as it's trying to take off in an area of Russia that is minus 45 degrees because it is immediately hitting the atmospheric conditions that are ripe for creating the ice crystals, essentially. Well, they're surrounded by ice anyway, so this is what is happening. So that's a bit of a lie there. And I'm not even sure why he would say that. Oh, maybe he has been told that, but who knows? It's certainly not true. Now, when he talks about the iridescence in the sky is really the sort of next bit of evidence that he says. If you remember, he talks about when he put on the sunglasses, it looked like there was sort of petrol in the sky. Apparently, this is actually a thing. It's not unusual. It's called cloud iridescence. And in the same way that you get that purpley greeny pattern because the petrol particles are sat on top of the liquid and they reflect in the sunlight in a strange way, it's the same thing. Basically, in certain atmospheric conditions, water droplets, which are in these clouds before they freeze to ice or as they melt, they catch the sunlight. And so they give the impression of like a sort of wavy haze. But again, this is a very, very well-known phenomenon. It's something that occurs naturally in clouds. It doesn't even have to be within contrails. So although that did sound rather unusual, that really doesn't show anything at all. It's just something that he's talking about. Now, one of the things that they talk about is all the people getting the flu-like conditions. And this dentist, Greg Hanford from Bakersfield, he said that he noticed all these contrails. And then at the time, there was a lot of people that got ill. And they all got the flu, including people that he worked with. And the government at the time, or the health department, put out a thing basically saying if you fit into certain criteria, phone this hotline and we'll treat you. And William Thomas and R agree that this is suspicious, that this is obviously a bioweapons simulation tracking program, and that they think that it's suspicious. Now, if we were to use the simplest explanation, it's probably that there was a flu bug going round and that the local health authority was trying to help people who had the flu. And the reason that there was certain parameters are that there's no point people going to get treated that are basically over it. Like, if you remember, it was how long have they been ill? Where are they? Where have they been? And stuff like that. Right. Now, that's framed in such a, well, where have you been? Like, wouldn't that more be akin to, are you local?
Yeah.
Because if you're not, there's other centres that you can go to, right? How long you've been ill. Well, if you've been ill for longer than a couple of weeks or whatever, there's probably no point coming to see us because...
It'd probably be okay.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
So, again, the framing of these things, and I get it, I do understand why. This isn't lying. This is just they're coming at it from a very sort of paranoid perspective, and they're searching for answers, and they think these things are connected, basically.
Flights are all year round, so there's always going to be flights leaving these coinciding with anything what happens ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, completely. I mean, they also speculate on the fact that these might be some sort of mass inoculation. When Art was trying to be sort of like benevolent, maybe
Trying to be optimistic.
Yeah. Maybe is that sort of thing. And the only problem with that is that there's literally no proof. It's pure speculation based on the understanding already that these are a thing, that these are an actual thing that is happening, that is nefarious or that is clandestine, that hasn't got an explanation that the industry or whoever or science can explain. Like, so they're already coming from, well, we know that this is something odd. Could it be this? Well, yeah, I mean, it could be in theory, but you've got to prove that it's a thing in the first place. Now, William Thomas, he then goes on to start saying stuff like, well, there's all these tests that we've done, that these substances, you will want to ingest them. Now, the problem again with this is that he doesn't tell us what these tests are. He heavily infers that there's some sort of nastiness going on. He doesn't actually say what it is or what the tests were or where he found it. He just says, I can build a case of pathogens deliberately making people ill. And he also says that, and here's one of the major things, and this is a bit of a revelation to me because I was like, oh yeah. He says that contrails can't stop and start because that's just not what they do. And so if they do stop and start, then they're obviously not a cloud. That's bollocks. How do I know that? Well, clouds stop and start. Have you ever noticed that? There's a cloud, then there's some blue sky, then there's... I know that sounds dead glib. Yeah, I know that sounds really glib, right? But, oh yeah, shit. Yeah, so I suppose contrails would perform in exactly the same way. Yes, because in order for that cloud to form and to retain and stay there, it needs to have certain atmospheric conditions. That's why today you're not going to see any contrails. Over the heat wave, you're not going to see any chemtrails, right? Okay. Why wouldn't they do it when everyone's at the beach?
Yeah.
Right? If they weren't trying to kill everybody, you know why you're not going to see it? The pressure's too high and there's not enough moisture in the atmosphere. And so people say this. They'll go online and go, I've noticed that there's been no spraying of the chemtrails over a couple of days. It's like, well, can you possibly take that day and look at the atmospheric conditions, the temperature, the weather conditions, etc., and then compare it to a day where there was lots of chemtrails? And I'll bet you'll notice on the day where there's lots of these lingering contrails that you like to call chemtrails, that there was low pressure, low temperature in the atmosphere, a lot of moisture, and probably a lot of naturally occurring cirrus clouds anyway.
And would it be the same amount of traffic?
Yeah.
As well, that's the question that you have to ask. Is there the same amount of traffic on a day that where you see lines, and as the same amount of traffic on a day that you don't see lines?
Absolutely.
Guarantee there's going to be the same amount of traffic.
Well, here's the thing, right? Okay, there's a lady on Twitter, a large up to her, called Deborah Sanderson, and she's desperately trying to sort of help people out with this. And she says that exact thing, but the opposite way around. You do know that we can track persistent contrails and judge where they're going to be for how long based on the weather conditions. And there are websites that track this, apparently. And she does this. She says, look, tomorrow the weather conditions are going to be like that. If the weather condition is going to be like this, you're going to see persistent contrails here, 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 and here. If the weather is going to be like this, you're not going to see any. You're not going to see any at all because the atmospheric conditions aren't suitable for it to form. Now, you could get people who are now going to say basically, well, that's just because they're, plus bollocks and
She knows when they're going to spray.
well, you could, they're not going to do it on the really hot days because when there's loads of people outside, loads of people will spot it and stuff. And it's like, come on, whatever. But this is the point. There is an explanation for it. And that really shocked me. I know it does sound glib. It's like, well, they can't stop and start. It's like, well, yes, they can because clouds stop and start. There's not always just one big ominous cloud, is there? There's loads. So again, it depends on a cool temperature and moisture, basically. And so when he goes on to say that he's also seen chemtrails coming from the tail of these tankers and not just the engines or halfway up. And that is a different thing. What happens there is either the wings or the plane tips, the mass of the plane going through the air creates like a pressure change, basically. And so that's why you get him coming off the wings tips and from the tail. And this isn't the same thing. These are completely different, but it's different conditions that cause this. But this is the atmospheric pressure change causing the temperature to drop enough to basically form a trail behind it. And these are why they're usually thin. And so it's a similar process to where they're coming out of the engine, but it's basically, again, it's to do with pressure and temperature drops. And so this is why they happen, essentially. So there is an explanation for it. So when this Major General is saying our tankers do not emit contrails, they don't fly high enough, which is a massive smoking gun if true, it's not true. It's not true on, as I say, both counts. One, those planes can fly that high. And two, it doesn't matter. It's to do with the temperature and the moisture and the atmospheric pressure.
So is it possible that this military guy is just fabricated, or is he a real guy who maybe doesn't know that much about aviation or whatever,
It could be either. The bloke could not exist. The bloke could have been genuine, but been told wrong advice. Or he could just be one of these sort of blokes that likes lying. And you'll never know because they don't really tell them, basically.
Yeah, it could just be someone in the Navy who's heard something.
Yeah.
An incorrect piece of information from someone in the Air Force. They've misinterpreted it, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hello, initiates of the Some Dare Call It Conspiracy podcast. Dom Jolly here. How are you? Sorry to butt in, but I just wanted to let you know that I've written, a book that I'm very, very proud of called The Conspiracy Tourist, in which I travel around the world taking a look at the weird world of conspiracies, and I think you might like it. Not only that, but I'm touring the book and doing live shows all around England from the 28th of Feb to the end of March, and it would be smashing to see you there. I think you'd like it. If you are interested, go to my website, www.domjolly.tv. And now, on with the podcast. Thanks.
Now, they basically go and say biological agents, known pathogens, organisms that come from research laboratories are being spread by these chemtrails. That is fact. They don't show any evidence to back this up. They just don't show any evidence to back this up. They do in White Hats, but we're going to come on to that in a little bit. Now, this was an interesting thing. Well, they talk about how in the world is a jelly-like goop continuing to fall from the vapor trails of aircraft. And they're referring to this 1994 Oakville incident. This is a genuine thing called star jelly. What it is a bit of a mystery. Some of it contains this particular type of bacteria, Pseudomonas fluorescens bacteria, and some of it has been shown to have DNA, sometimes even human DNA in it. And so people are slightly freaked out by what this is. Chris Packham of the Really Wild Show got involved with this, and he took some of it to be sampled, and he found that it contained degraded, but what looked like amphibian DNA in it. And the reason it's called star jelly is because it's associated with meteor showers. Like folklore says that it comes down off meteors, and it seems to be observed when there's been meteor activities or whatever. Is this anything to do with chemtrails? No, it's not. No, it's absolutely nothing to do with chemtrails. How do we know it's nothing to do with chemtrails? Because the first recorded incident of star jelly happened in the 1300s.
Okay.
Right. So unless, of course, we're looking at Naomi Wolf's Time Machine Apple Watch, right? I don't think that this is connected to chemtrails. It is a little bit of a mystery what this star jelly is. The leading theory at the minute is that it's frog spawn that's been ate by buzzards and then vomited back up. And so that's why it's got sort of degraded amphibian DNA in it. That's why it looks a bit gungy and stuff like that. But it's not clear what it is, basically. But it's certainly not connected to chemtrails, basically. He then basically says, like, like if you're worried about this, if you see the cloud cover, go inside. For God's sake, get inside and be safe. It's like, it's not going to help. Again, because of the nature of contrails and persistent contrails and clouds, they get blown for miles. Like, this is the point. Like, this is why chemtrails wouldn't work as a theory. Because basically, if there's a chemtrail above you, that's not going to land on you, right? It's going to land hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So it doesn't make sense to do it over the population centres. It makes sense to do it over places where there's absolutely nobody, because then it would drift to places where there's lots of people. This is how far it travels. This is, again, why you get the grid patterns and stuff like that, because these are miles and miles away, but all going roughly the same direction, due south or whatever. And as the wind blows, it gives the artificial impression that they're going in formation, like the red arrows or whatever. What about Joe Burton, the bloke that started, coughing up blood and urinating blood and stuff? Not Jackie Devoy's friend, but this guy who spat up jelly and had joint pain and tenderness. Now, you may have noticed, like in the early description, that we said that the problem was that it had affected his liver and his gallbladder and his one kidney. Now, there was a bit of a clue there. Because you see all of these things, joint pain, tenderness, urinating, coughing up blood, etc., etc., etc. These are all symptoms of acute kidney failure. And this is something that can happen to people if they don't take care of themselves and they only have one kidney, essentially. So the problem is to use this as proof of some sort of derogatory effect just doesn't work, because basically the symptoms match a disease that he's probably likely to get anyway. But anyway, William Thomas whacked him on this body scan 2010.
What is the medical literature backing up this device?
There is none. In fact, the FDA... let's not damn it immediately. According to the literature, the body scan 2010 uses bioenergetic stress testing to identify and cure stress systems on the body. However, the FDA says that basically the firm agreed that the labeling of the device was not to include any reference for the device for treating any medical condition at all, and that it is useless as both a diagnostic and treatment tool. So again, whilst that's not necessarily connected to chemtrails per se, but it does give you the impression that potentially this William Thomas, who up until this point seemed like fairly sensible, might not be the most credulous of people, or might be more credulous than you'd give credit for. But, he mentions weather as a force multiplier. He basically finishes that first interview by saying, look, it's a real thing. Weather as a force multiplier, owning the weather in 2025, is proof that chemtrails exist. It's absolutely 100% proof. Right. There's a problem with that as a theory. There's two problems with this, right? One, the document doesn't mention chemtrails at all. It doesn't mention cloud seeding. It doesn't mention injecting particulate into the atmosphere. It mentions absolutely nothing that is even close to chemtrails. It does mention weather modification and stuff like that, but it doesn't talk about using chemtrails. It talks about using all sorts of exotic, as yet not invented technologies. You know why? Because it's a fictional account, by which I mean, there's a disclaimer. 2025 is a study designed to comply with a directive from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force to examine the concepts, capabilities, and technologies that the USA will require to remain the dominant air and space force in the future. Presented on 17th of June 1996, this report was produced in the DoD school environment of academic freedom and in the interest of advancing concepts related to national defense. The views expressed in this report are those of the authorities and do not reflect the official policy or position of the US Air Force, DoD, or US government. This report contains completely fictional representations of future scenarios and situations, and any similarities to real people or events other than those specifically cited are unintentional and for the purpose of illustration only. So, unfortunately, this document that is apparently a smoking gun that all these crazy, wacky, exotic weaponry is happening, it's not a real document. Well, it is a real document, but it's a purely speculative document.
It's basically them workshopping some ideas.
Yeah, and it's so completely sort of like really think outside the box. Could we, like, it's that sort of thing. Could we use the weather to destroy China and stuff with lightning and things like that? And it's like, stuff that comic book stuff, real comic book stuff, basically. And again, as you said, it's just like a thought experiment. Go as hog wild as you can, and then we'll track back and see if any of that is actually plausible. But the major smoking gun is at no point in the document anywhere does it mention chemtrails.
That's wild.
Also, it seems to be kind of similar in character to the whole "you will own nothing, be happy" thing. It's just like a workshopped idea, an essay, etc.
Yeah, precisely. Absolutely. Now, there is the Hughes pattern, which came out in 1990, the stratospheric Welsbeck seeding for reduction of global warming. Is this a real document? Yes, this is 100% a real document. And it's passed through various ownership throughout the years. It's a pattern, and it describes a method of geoengineering, a method that could be mistaken for the theory of chemtrails. However, it's never been done. There's no evidence that it's been done. There's no company that does it. It's just a pattern. Now, there's a patent for a bed that wakes you up by dunking you into a bowl of water. It doesn't mean that it's been made or that it's going to be made. It meant that one person thought that it was a good idea. Now, to be fair, this is considered a viable geoengineering tool. David Keith has said, this is a possibility and it is easy to do. But proposing an idea and doing an idea are two completely different things. And we'll come on to this later, but there's huge amounts of reasons that they wouldn't want to do that. But we'll not spoil that. We'll come on to it later. But essentially, so the two documents, and this is where the concept of chemtrails really came from the Welsbeck Hughes pattern and from the Owning the Weather document, and it's been somewhat mashed together. But it's not proof by any stretch of the imagination, and it's certainly not proof that it's being done. It shows that this has been a consideration and that there was a company that basically got the machinery to do it and that it could be done, but it doesn't mean that it has been done.
Yeah, I remember seeing a sort of documentary from like 2006 or whatever where they were talking about using boats to spray stuff up to create clouds to reduce weather. It's never been done,
No.
That was in 2006.
Well, this is the thing. I guarantee that'll be the same people. It's David Keith and various geoengineering people. And geoengineering is a real thing in as much as it's a potential solution to the problem of climate change. But we'll come on to that shortly. And there's a very good explanation as to why none of this has actually happened yet. So William Thomas with his, yes, chemtrails are real. Again, he's just basically going over his story. He says that he got the video from William Wallace. He looked at it. He reported on it. He appeared on Art Bell. Prove it, they said. So I did. And he really just doesn't, basically. When he says, but airliners do not fly grid formations together, they do not make perfect X's visible from satellites or fly head-on passes at each other, obsessed with making efficient A to B passages along rigidly specified air routes, they do not linger for hours in an area, nor do scheduled flights suddenly increase for a week, only to vanish for months at a time. Now, they do. They do have similar flight paths. Flight paths are basically only altered by the wind. The wind also moves the contrails, and the wind are stronger higher up. So the contrails move more. So contrails essentially can move over 100 miles quite easily. So again, aside from the fact that means that basically if you're trying to poison a population with contrails, it would never be accurate. And they need specific conditions in order to create. So when he's saying, how come we're seeing contrails today and we didn't see any yesterday, it's for that very reason. It's because it was warmer yesterday, basically. It's because there wasn't as much, the pressure was higher and there wasn't as much moisture in the atmosphere. But, he's thought about that. He says, I spoke to Clifford Carnicom, Wilford. I can't remember my own writing here. The Carnicom fellow, who said that basically he'd gone to NASA's own data and he'd looked at it. Basically, he'd seen 21 days of heavy gridding and he found there was 30% humidity. And he says that this is not enough humidity to form contrails in the mainstream explanation. And, shocking if true. So anyway, I went and looked at this data, and he's lying. He's just absolutely 100% lying. I found the humidity on weatherunderground.com, the NASA humidity levels for Santa Fe in 1999, right? Which he said there was no days where this humidity was sufficient. Well, that's bollocks. In March 1999, there were 29 days where the humidity was way above 30 degrees. In April 99, there were 27 days where it was above 30 degrees. In May 99, there were 21 days where it was above 30 degrees humidity. In June 99, there was 20 days where it was above 30 degrees humidity, 30% humidity. And in July 99, there were 30 days where it was above 30% humidity. So he's just lying.
That's complete lying. Like every month, there was over half of the days were perfect conditions.
Particularly, and you'll notice, this is ridiculous, isn't it? So, and that kind of blows the theory as well, because he's saying it's happening in the summer months, and they shouldn't be happening in the summer months. Well, it correlates with the humidity. Like, we can look at the records, we can look at the humidity. It only happens on the days where there's that humidity. So, again, he's just lying there, basically. The next sort of smoking gun that he talks about is where he's saying that the airport attendant, Terry Stewart, he's the lead singer of the Specials. I don't think it's the same guy. Anyway, he saw the large X's forming, and basically he says, there's a military exercise that's going on, and William Thomas infers that this completely destroys the airliner hoax, showing that persistent contrails only come from military planes. Well, that's bollocks, because as we say, we've seen loads and loads of footage of it coming from commercial planes. There's simply lots. So these nonsense, and for this bloke to go, it's a military exercise, there's an X, that shows that only the X's come from military exercises, is just not the way that it works. All it shows is that there was a military exercise going on. That's it. It doesn't show that the military exercise was based on chemtrails. It just shows that there was an exercise going on. So, it just doesn't work, I'm afraid. When he talks about KC-135s and basically saying that they don't fly high enough, again, for contrails, I went on the Boeing website, and apparently the KC-135 can fly up to 41,000 feet. So essentially that's plenty. Now, what he says is, right, according to the FAA, large military aircraft travel at 30,000 feet to avoid commercial aircraft, which is at 35 to 39,000 feet, and that refueling takes place at 15,000 to 25,000 feet, so it shouldn't form contrails. Again, it's nonsense. But also, when you see short contrails, now I know from our perspective they look like they're going straight along, but that can also be caused by the pressure change as you're climbing. And as you're climbing through the atmosphere, in the same way that basically there's a cloud there, but there's not a cloud there, the conditions to form the cloud are very, very specific. So there can be pockets where basically there isn't the sufficient conditions to form that. So if you're seeing these gaps in them, that could be that basically the plane is climbing. But from our perspective, we just see it beneath. And so it looks like a sort of dangling, basically. So, so again, unfortunately, like there's just there's not a huge amount there, really. Like, it's all based on the misunderstanding that contrails don't persist, and him saying, "Oh, I'm seeing this a lot more than when I was a kid. I don't really tend to see this." But that's true. There's more planes nowadays. There's huge numbers of planes nowadays compared to even the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? And the more planes there are, the more likely you are to get the conditions where you would cause those persistent contrails. The more balls you throw at enough coconuts, the more fish you win. Like, it's just how it works. I don't think of William Thomas. I think he's genuine. I think he's genuinely concerned. But I think his evidence isn't particularly strong. Now, we've not come on to white twats yet, so they could, and they did all the experiments and tests. So, all that's shown is that basically there's a misunderstanding, that basically contrails do act like that, but that doesn't necessarily negate his concerns about the aluminium and stuff like that. And if chemtrails aren't real, why on earth did Dennis Kunitz mention them? You remember Dennis Kunitz, the congressman of Ohio in 2001? He put out 2977 and basically listed chemtrails as an exotic weapon. And lots of people sort of jumped on this and says, "Oh, have you seen this? These mentioned this." And what happened was later, this paper was revised and all references to that type of thing was taken out. People jumped on that as a cover-up. What actually happened, right, was this. I don't know whether anybody noticed this, right? Laser weapons.
Yeah.
They're on there.
Yeah, I think I heard that's what he was mentioning earlier.
Extraterrestrial weapons, tectonic weapons, earthquake-making machines he's talking about. He's got the list off the internet. The bloke it says more about Dennis Kunitz. What's happened is some of those things are legitimate. There was the Star Wars program. There are certain things that are exotic weaponry. Like, there is even stuff like, synthetic telepathy type stuff and horrible stuff, the LRADs and things like that, but like taken up to 11 that can really cause damage to people and stuff like that. He wants to include all of those things. But you'll notice as well, it basically says any object by any other unacknowledged or as yet undeveloped means. So he's just putting as many types of weaponry on there as possible, right? And then somebody in his staff has come up and gone, "Dennis, you've put extraterrestrial weapons and chemtrails on here. Do you not think that makes you look like an idiot?" And he's gone, "Shit, yeah, it does, doesn't it? Like, knackers. I'll take that off on the second draft of that." And that is literally it. This is not an admission that the government has all of these things. This is a list that he's got off the internet, essentially. He's cast his net as far and wide as possible. Again, potentially for actual sort of legitimate concerns and for real reasons. But unfortunately, it really says more about Dennis Kunitz than it says about the actual validity of the document.
Thank you for listening to Chemtrails on Trial, produced by Brent Lee and Neil Sanders for Some Dare Call It Conspiracy. And don't forget, if you can't wait for next week, do join us on patreon.com/somedarecallitconspiracy, where you'll not only be able to get the entire series right now, but also ad-free episodes, plus tons of other goodies, including my music, Neil's books, audiobooks of Neil's, and art by Nicholas C. Gray. You can also find all our links at www.somedarecallitconspiracy.com.